If you hear mysterious noises and sounds, if you hear your name called when there's no one around, keep going, dear listener. This story is for you. I hope it will accomplish what I wrote it to do. In these words, you will find all the tools you'll need so that when you're faced with unimaginable things, you won't react with fear, as most people do. You'll be equipped, calm, and able to see the truth. My best, Hedy. This is What We Keep Hidden. By Lauren Nicole. Chapter 5. Betty. After fighting our way through the bushes, we spotted a small but grand house looming in the distance. Its sharp, angled roofline cut ominously through the late afternoon sky. The dark windows gaped like open mouths on all sides. On the front porch, an older woman was sitting in a rocking chair, with a cigar in one hand and an oil-like drink in the other. Her messy bun could barely contain her long white hair, and had almost come undone, yet somehow still looked quite elegant. She leaned toward the black cat as it made its way up the stairs.
"Where did you go?"
she scolded the cat, as white smoke billowed from her mouth. I might be able to answer that, I heard myself say.
Ah!
The woman shrieked, jumping back in her chair.
"Oh, good grief, kid,"
she said, seeing me.
"This is private property, you know,"
she exclaimed as she held a hand to her chest, settling her nerves. Sorry, I said, inching closer. I didn't mean to startle you. We found your cat in a tree earlier. It jumped in my arms and...
He,
she interrupted. What?
He. You said it, and he is a he.
Oh, he, I stammered. We found him in a tree not too long ago, and...
Who is this we you keep referring to, child? Are you well? There's only one of you.
Annoyed at how much she interrupted me, I looked down to see Lucy was, in fact, not with me. Looking back towards the oaks, I saw her standing cautiously near the bushes we had just come through. Come here, I whispered, slightly embarrassed. Lucy cautiously walked over to join me. Me and Lucy, I said to the woman. She grunted, looking down her nose at us disapprovingly.
Well, what are you doing out here so late in the day? Shouldn't you be at home, having dinner?
We were just heading back. You see, Lucy got away from me, and I assume she went running after your cat.
Ah, I see,
the woman said.
So this is Lucy.
Yes, I answered. And I'm Hedy.
Ah, like the actress.
She leaned back, closed her eyes, and nodded with a look of nostalgia. No, the inventor, I corrected. One eye shot open. She looked at me through her inquisitively lifted eyebrows.
You're too young to know that.
Well, Mrs. Mom is a big fan of old Hollywood, and we watch Hedy's movies all the time. She made sure I knew she wasn't just an actress, but an inventor, too. Like I am. I smiled proudly.
Interesting.
She looked me up and down, examining me like a scanning laser. You never told me your name? I pointed out.
The name's Betty, kid,
she said as she motioned for me to come closer.
Come here so I can get a better look at both of you.
The stairs creaked as I placed my weight on each one. Betty sat in an old wooden rocking chair that had been worn down after many afternoons in the sun. Next to her was a large chair with a faded floral cushion. Its high-weaved back made it look like more of a throne than a chair. As I got closer, I could see a thick film of dust had collected on it, as though no one sat there for a very long time.
Have a seat, Hedy, and tell me why on earth you're wearing a raincoat on a clear day like this.
Betty motioned towards the wicker throne. Oh, this? I asked, preparing myself for the onslaught about getting a purse. I find it useful for the pockets, and the hood helps block out bright light. Betty said, contemplating.
Practical. However, a utility belt may be a better choice on these hot summer days. You know, to avoid heat stroke and all that.
Speechless at the lack of the "you need a purse" speech I usually got, I stood motionless, staring awkwardly at her.
You know, we have something in common,
she said finally, folding her arms across her chest. We do? I asked as I shook the shock out of my head and began to wipe the film of dust from the cushion with my sleeve.
Our namesakes, both favorite actresses of our mothers.
Namesakes. I hadn't heard the word before, and it felt odd as it rolled around on my tongue.
Namesakes!
Betty said louder. You can say it as loud as you want. I still don't know what it means, I said.
Who you're named after,
she scoffed. Assuming Betty was at least in her 70s, I ran through a list of all the film stars from that era. Of course, I left a buffer of movie stars from a decade later and earlier than my initial assessment of her age. Betty Davis? I asked.
Impressive,
Betty said with a tinge of astonishment.
Exactly right. Only she decided to spell mine with a Y instead of an E, so her decision wasn't so obvious.
I sat there contemplating Betty's mother's decision. You know, that might have been for the best, I mentioned. The first time I saw Now Voyager, I kept calling her Bet.
Ha ha!
Betty's loud, bellowing laugh rang out, scaring me a bit. She laughed how I assumed a crow would, hearing a funny joke.
All right, kid. So, which movies do you like to watch with your namesake? Since you seem to be so knowledgeable about all this stuff.
Well, my favorite is Dishonored Lady, but Ziegfeld Girl is fun to watch.
Ah, Ziegfeld Girl. It is a beautiful movie, isn't it? But Dishonored Lady? Really?
Betty asked. Yeah, she has everything. The job, the social life, nice things, but she still struggles. If she can have all that and still struggle, then I don't feel so bad about... My voice trailed off. Betty put a hand on my wrist in a very calming manner compared to her relative abruptness earlier. It made me want to stop fidgeting with my buttons. I looked up at her and saw her smiling.
You know, she said, that's why it's one of my favorites, too.
I smiled back.
Did you ever hear about Miss Lamar's father?
Betty asked, leaning back into her rocking chair again. I hesitated.
Let me jog your memory. Her father took her around when she was young and explained how things worked. I spent similar afternoons with my father, since I had a curious imagination back then, too, and a voracious appetite for knowledge. That's even something my Jimmy and I shared.
I turned in my chair to face her, putting one foot on the cushion and holding my knee to contain my excitement. Oh, that's what Miss Mom told me, I shouted. When I started asking about how things worked and taking things apart, she told me all about Hedy Lamar. She said we shared the same interests because we share the same name.
Ha ha! Wonderful. Do you still take things apart?
Mm-hmm. Of course, it's much easier now that I have my own set of power tools.
I imagine that would make it a bit easier. Did you save up for them?
No, it was a Christmas present from Mr. Dad one year. Mrs. Mom wasn't too happy, but I'm very careful and safe when I use them. So she's warmed up to me having them.
Good. But I was correct in hearing you referred to your parents as Mrs. Mom and Mr. Dad.
Oh, yeah.
Is that how families look to you? A Mrs. and Mr.?
This wasn't the first time this conversation happened, so I figured I'd just nip it in the bud. Of course not. There's as many family types as there are fingerprints. This just happens to be mine. Don't worry, if they identified differently, I would have reflected that, I clarified.
Ah, direct.
Betty chuckled.
I like that. Still, it's a little formal, no?
That's what Mr. Dad asked for. He specifically said Daddy was infantile after a certain age.
Ha ha! What an odd family you are. I am glad you settled near.
We both smiled at each other and looked out the view from the porch. The last rays of sunlight were reaching towards us, while shadows began to stretch and awaken, for their time was coming soon.
Oh, how quickly it got dark. Hurry, you should be getting home now, before it's too dark to see.
Agreeing, I got up from my chair and thanked Betty for her kindness and for being so understanding with Humphrey. Without knowing, my notebook, which had hung precariously out of my pocket, was finally dislodged and fell onto the porch. I called Lucy, who had cuddled in a fur pile with Humphrey, and she reluctantly stretched and yawned, then joined me at the bottom of the stairs of the porch. We headed for the oak grove, and when we reached the tree line, we turned back towards the house and waved one last goodbye to Betty and Humphrey. In an upstairs window on the side of the house, a curtain swayed, and the movement caught my eye. As I focused on it in the dimming light, a shadowy figure of a man standing in front of the window frame became clearer. Goosebumps popped up on my arm as the hairs at the back of my neck began to prickle and raise. Slowly, the feeling that Lucy and I were being watched began creeping up my spine. I tore my eyes away to take a quick glance at Lucy, who was also keenly focused on the same window. Come along, I told her. Didn't she mention a Jimmy earlier? Lucy and I turned and continued to walk into the grove, but curiosity got the better of me. I turned to take one last look at the house through the leaves. Betty and Humphrey had gone inside, and light was pouring out from the windows downstairs. I looked up to find the figure in the window was still there, watching. I could follow Betty's movements through the house by which windows had light. As she headed upstairs, lights flooded the second-story windows, showing her progress. Finally, Betty turned on the last light, the one that illuminated the room the figure was in. Except, as soon as she turned it on, the figure disappeared. Thank you for joining us on this episode of What We Keep Hidden. Tune in next time to find out what happens with Hedy and Betty, Humphrey and Lucy. What We Keep Hidden is written, narrated, and produced by Lauren Nicole. This has been a Lauren Nicole creation.